In the summer of 2010, two 17-year-old friends from the town of Greenwood, Virginia, disappeared without a trace. Hannah Reed and Catherine Morris had gone on a bike ride in the Appalachian Mountains and promised to return by evening. Their bikes were later found near the beginning of a forest trail, but the girls themselves were not. 7 years later, a hunter, hiding from a thunderstorm in an abandoned cabin, came across a digital recorder. There was only one file inside. This recording forced investigators to reopen the case and brought fear back to a town that had already learned to live with silence. The town of Greenwood, Virginia, was one of those small towns that don't usually appear on tourist maps. There were no major roads, just a few streets that intersected near the church and the old school. In the summer, life seemed even slower. The heat kept people in the shade, and in the evenings, neighbors gathered on their porches to discuss the daily news. It was in this atmosphere that 17-year-old Hannah Reed and Catherine Morris, friends who were known to almost everyone, lived. Hannah had blonde hair, always in a braid, and a quiet smile that even her teachers noticed. She was an excellent student at school and planned to become a nurse after graduation. Her father worked as a mechanic in a local workshop, and her mother taught elementary school. Catherine, on the other hand, had a more edgy personality, dark hair, athletic build, and a constant fascination with cycling. Her family ran a small coffee shop near the exit from the town where she often helped out after school. The differences between them only strengthened their friendship. Everyone considered them inseparable. They almost always appeared together. On June 23, 2010, they decided to go for a bike ride in the mountains. This was not unusual. They spent their summers doing just that, riding along the roads near Appalachia. The plan was simple: ride a few miles to a familiar trail, stop at a viewpoint, have a snack, and return in the evening. They took small backpacks. Hannah had a bottle of water, an apple, and a light raincoat, and Catherine had a few bars and another bottle. They left their phones at home, explaining to their parents that there would not even be a signal in the mountains. This was a commonplace decision for a small town where cell phone service in the forest was indeed often lost. The last time they were seen in the afternoon, a neighbor recalled them passing by her yard, laughing and chattering to each other. At the crossroads near the store, they stopped to buy chewing gum and a bottle of lemonade. The shopkeeper would later say that the girls looked happy, not at all like they were going far away. They were really planning a simple trip. The road they were traveling on led to an old forest route that started a few miles from the town. Where the asphalt lane ended, there was a dirt path that was well known to local teenagers and hunters. The forest in this place was dense, with tall oaks and lindens that closed overhead, creating shade even during the day. Entering it always seemed like something else, as if the city was left behind, and another world began ahead, darker and more isolated from everyday life. Hannah and Catherine left their bikes at the edge of the trail. This would be confirmed later. They were standing neatly, leaning against each other under a tree. And this is where the reliable traces of their day end. The girls disappeared as soon as they stepped deeper into the forest. When it got dark, their parents began to worry. It was unusual for Hannah to stay late without warning. She always wrote a note if she planned to stay at a friend's house or return later. Catherine also usually told her mother, especially in the summer when she helped out at the coffee shop. That evening, the phones were silent, the doors remained locked, and the rooms were empty. In Greenwood, people are used to silence, but that night it was different. The lights in the Reed and Morris houses stayed on until morning. The road to the trail, which the girls had taken during the day, was now associated with anxiety. It seemed that they had simply disappeared between the trees. The story of their disappearance began in an ordinary way, but in this ordinariness lay the greatest mystery. No signs of danger, no conflicts, no intentions to escape. Two 17-year-old friends simply went for a day trip and never returned. The morning of June 24th in Greenwood began with phone calls that changed the usual rhythm of the town. Hannah hadn't returned home, and her father, who had woken up before dawn, thought at first that his daughter had spent the night at a friend's house. But when they called the Maurices, it turned out that Catherine was not at home either. The two families simultaneously realized that something had happened that they could not explain. Hannah's mother recalled feeling a coldness in her chest even then, not the usual teenage prank, not being late, but something deeper. They knew that the girls were going to ride for only a day. They had no clothes for the night, no extra supplies. Their absence at this hour was unnatural. The parents met outside before the sun had fully risen. Within an hour, the news spread among the neighbors, and by noon, the local police were informed of the disappearance. At first, the officer on duty reacted with restraint. The police department had already seen teenagers run away to a party or spend the night at a friend's house. But the coincidence of the two girls and the lack of telephone communication immediately made the situation more serious. The first action was to go to the trail where the girls were used to going. The relatives also went there. The journey took only a few minutes by car. On the roadside, under a massive oak tree, there were two bicycles. They were neatly leaning against each other, as if the girls had left them for a few minutes. The wheels were not flat, the chains were in place, and helmets were hanging on the handlebars. No signs of haste or struggle. This picture immediately made my heart sink. They had clearly entered the forest on foot. The police examined the scene. There were tire and sneaker marks on the ground of the trail, but nothing to explain why they didn't return. Dogs, brought in specially from the nearest county, picked up the scent of the girls' belongings and moved forward. Their barking and sharp jerks at first gave hope. Everyone, including parents and neighbors who came to help, followed with bated breath. A few hundred meters from the road, the dogs suddenly began to get confused. They were either stretching deeper or circling, whining as if they did not understand where to go next. The trail ended suddenly. Only ordinary sneaker prints were visible on the ground, lost in a dense carpet of branches and leaves. No torn fabric, no fallen objects, no signs of a struggle. The police tried to comb the trail further, but there was no result. One of the dog handlers later recalled, "The dogs seemed to have hit a wall. They were walking confidently, and then there was nothing. Emptiness." This detail would become one of the most mysterious moments of the entire investigation. By the evening, several cars were parked at the entrance to the forest, and people were walking in circles, trying to find at least some sign. Mothers were sitting on the roadside clutching their daughters' backpacks that they had found at home. Light, almost empty, they only confirmed that the girls had set off on a hike without the intention of staying long. The town of Greenwood began to stand still, waiting for news. For people accustomed to a predictable life, the idea that two schoolgirls had simply disappeared in broad daylight seemed impossible. In the evening, when it was officially confirmed that the girls had disappeared, there was what was later called the first wave of anxiety. The lights in the houses were on until late at night, and the only conversations were about where Anna and Catherine could have gone. The disappearance no longer looked like a misunderstanding. The bicycles standing by the trail became a symbol of their absence, as if the door to the forest had opened and closed behind them forever. In the first days after the disappearance, dozens of people appeared in the forest. The police organized groups and recruited volunteers from the town and neighboring villages. The streets of Greenwood were empty because almost everyone felt it was their duty to get involved. The paths that the girls could have taken branched off in different directions, and it seemed like it would take hours to find them. But the further the searchers went, the more the feeling of hopelessness grew. The forest in that part of Appalachia was dense and heavy. The tall trees created a dark corridor even during the day, and the humid air reflected off the bark so that footsteps sounded hollow. The sound seemed to be lost in the chaos of branches and roots. The people walked in rows, keeping each other a few meters apart so as not to miss a single thing. Some had sticks and kept turning over the leaves, while others peered closely at the soil. But there were no traces. They found no crumpled candy bar wrappers, no traces of a fire, not even sneaker tracks, except for those that were lost right after the first section of the trail. It was unnatural. Usually, even the most careful hikers leave behind crumbs, especially when it comes to teenagers with light backpacks. Someone throws away a paper, someone loses a bottle cap, someone breaks a branch. Here, there is nothing. The only thing that caught my eye was lying right in the middle of the trail, about half a kilometer away from where the bikes were. It was a small hair clip, simple, metal, with an engraved pattern. Hannah's mother confirmed that it was the one her daughter had. She often wore it to hold a strand of hair near her temple. The barrette was lying there as if it had fallen out by accident, but she gave no explanation. For investigators, it was a strange marker. It was too obvious to ignore, but too isolated to be used to create a picture. There were no other objects, no torn fabric, no bloodstains. It seemed that after that point, the girls had simply vanished. The search dogs lost the trail again and again. They reacted near the place with the bicycles, led people several hundred meters deeper, but each time they lost the landmark. The dog handlers tried to give the scent again, but the result was the same. The dogs walked in circles, whined, and lost direction. In the protocols, it was written that the trail broke off in an unknown way. The volunteers returned every evening tired and irritated. Some said they had never seen anything like it. Others openly assumed the worst. Rumors spread in the town. Some talked about predators, others that the girls could have fallen into one of the caves or ravines. But official searchers emphasized no signs of struggle or animal activity were found. Especially striking was the absence of even the smallest things. Catherine's backpack contained a pack of energy bars. Hannah had a small raincoat. If they were walking along the trail and intended to stop, it was logical that something would have fallen out and been lost. But the forest remained clean. This gave rise to another suspicion. Perhaps they hadn't gone that deep at all. But then, how to explain the hairpin? It was proof that they had walked at least a few hundred meters. After that, there was nothing. When the searchers returned to the town in the evenings, their faces showed not only fatigue, but also something akin to fear. Everyone is used to tourists getting lost in the mountains, but even in such cases, there is always a trace: scattered equipment, torn branches, clothes. Here, there was nothing. The hairpin was the only material evidence that the girls had actually set foot on this trail, and it was this detail that made the story even more disturbing. Everyone began to realize that this did not look like a random wander. It looked like someone had cut them out of space, leaving only one object as a reminder. After the first week of fruitless searching had passed, the county police finally issued an official statement. The police press release sounded restrained and helpless at the same time. It is likely that Hannah Reed and Catherine Morris got lost in the mountains and were victims of exhaustion or an accident. Behind these dry words was an attempt to put an end to the matter, at least formally. For law enforcement, this version seemed the most convenient. Tourists regularly got lost in the Appalachian forest. The terrain is difficult, with many ravines, hidden caves, and wetlands. One wrong step is enough to get a person in a place where there is no way out. Logic dictated that two 17-year-old girls with no real hiking experience could easily get into trouble. But despite its outward plausibility, this version did not hold up in detail. First, They went on an easy bike ride and planned to return the same day. Secondly, after so many days of searching, no evidence was found. No belongings, no body, not even a piece of clothing. Usually, in such cases, there are at least some traces: scattered equipment, backpacks, and fall marks. Here, there was nothing but that single hairpin. The girls' families categorically rejected the official version. The mothers said that their daughters were not irresponsible. They knew these places since childhood and had been there more than once. In addition, even in the event of a fall or injury, there had to be something left behind that would indicate a tragedy. They couldn't have just disappeared, Catherine's mother repeated. But, for the police, the lack of results meant a gradual curtailment of efforts. Search teams were getting smaller and smaller, and volunteers were losing strength. After 2 weeks, the official headquarters was disbanded. The reports read, "It is likely that the bodies remain in inaccessible areas. The search is complicated by weather conditions." Translated into simple language, this meant that there was almost no chance. For the town, this position sounded like a cold sentence. People who had been out in the woods in rows just yesterday were now returning to their routine. The Morris's coffee shop became quiet, and the doors opened less frequently. For the first time in a long time, the Reeds' house was plunged into darkness. The parents no longer sat up all night with the lights on, hoping for their daughter's return. The newspapers wrote briefly, "The 2 schoolgirls were probably victims of an accident." But the community itself felt that the words "probably" and "accident" did not answer the main question. Why was nothing found? The silence that followed the end of the official search was even more depressing than the cries of search dogs in the forest. It seemed that the authorities had put an end to the search, but in fact, they had left a huge void. The families felt abandoned. And it was from that moment on that the story stopped being just a tragedy and began to become a mystery. A year has passed since the disappearance of Hannah Reed and Catherine Morris. The town of Greenwood was gradually returning to its slow routine, but their absence remained like a shadow that never left the streets. It was then that the journalists returned to the case. A newspaper from a neighboring county published an article with a telling headline, "Girls Swallowed by the Forest." The author recalled that the police had never found any evidence of an accident. The text emphasized, "The absence of bodies or things makes the investigators' version unconvincing." This article provoked a new wave of interest. Television crews came to Greenwood, journalists asked neighbors, and filmed bicycles that were still stored in the police station yard. Parallels began to appear in the stories. It turned out that the disappearances in that part of Appalachia were not an isolated incident. Back in the 90s, 2 hikers from North Carolina never returned from a hike. In 2005, a local hunter reported his partner missing. Official documents did not give a clear picture. Some cases were closed as probable drowning, others as death by fall. But together, they added up to alarming statistics. Local residents began to share rumors that they had kept to themselves. Older people recalled that their parents had talked about the cursed path. According to the legend, it went deeper into the mountains than it seemed and brought people back differently, if at all. Some said that you could hear footsteps behind you in the forest even when you were walking alone. Others claimed to have seen strange lights between the trees. For journalists, these stories were sensationalized. Television reports combined the dry facts of the case with dark shots of the night forest. The place that won't let go was the name given to the area in the reports. Of course, the official investigators avoided commenting on the curse, but they themselves felt public pressure. People did not want to hear about a banal accident. They demanded a different explanation. The girls' families tried not to get involved in these legends. But it was impossible to avoid them. At school, classmates whispered about the two who were taken by the forest. Primary school children were afraid to even play near that trail. There were fewer tourists in the region. The Morris's coffee shop was almost empty because people did not want to sit at the tables next to the photos of the missing Katerina. Journalists, on the other hand, were pushing the topic even harder. In an interview with a former rescuer, he said, "There has always been something strange in those places, as if the forest itself was erasing traces." On the air, it sounded like a confirmation of the legend, although in the protocols everything looked much more prosaic. So slowly, the official tragedy turned into a story with elements of mysticism. The cursed path became a part of local folklore, and the disappearance of Hannah and Catherine became the main proof of its existence. This image did not bring answers, but made the case even more eerie. Where there should have been logic, there was only silence and a dark forest that stubbornly refused to reveal its secrets. As the years passed, the disappearance of Hannah Reed and Catherine Morris gradually became a part of Greenwood's everyday life. First, a month passed, then a year, and the town learned to talk about the girls in fragments, half-phrases, as if they were something everyone remembered but no one could explain. Over time, only brief mentions remained in daily conversations. There, on the path, you remember. Hannah and Catherine's names were heard less often, but their absence was felt everywhere. The Reed's house remained with windows that stayed lit longer in the evenings than the neighbors. Hannah's father would silently walk out onto the porch and stare into the darkness, as if hoping to see a familiar silhouette with a bicycle. Catherine's mother continued to work in the coffee shop, but there was always a framed photo of her daughter at one of the tables. Tourists who accidentally came to the cafe would turn away in embarrassment, but the locals were used to it and drank their coffee in silence next to the black and white image. Every year, on June 23rd, Hannah's mother would walk to the trail. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers and a small photo of her daughter. This tradition became almost a ritual. People would see her putting the flowers near the oak tree where the bikes were parked that day and sitting next to it for a long time, sometimes until sunset. She hardly ever spoke, but her presence reminded everyone that the tragedy was not over, even if the police had long since closed the case. Time passed slowly in Greenwood. New generations of students appeared in the school's corridors, but everyone knew the story of the two who never returned. Younger children were afraid to even go near that path. Some teenagers tried to test themselves. They went there to prove their courage. They would come back, laugh, but their stories always contained a shadow of fear. They said the forest was too quiet, and something not belonging to nature could be heard behind the tree crowns. For the parents, the past years were a test of silence. No one could explain why no bodies were found, why the hairpin was the only thing left. Official files with materials were gathering dust in the archives. Journalists returned to the topic from time to time, but no new facts emerged. Only old photos that caused the same pain every time. A strange duality developed in the city. Outwardly, life went on. Shops were open, holidays were held, children went to school. But there was always a pause in conversations when it came to the forest. It was too heavy to ignore, but too empty to talk about frankly. 7 years is the time after which even the most persistent hopes begin to fade. The Reed and Morris families did not use the word funeral, but they no longer left extra plates on the tables as they had the first year. The pain gradually turned into a tacit acceptance that there would be no answers. But even in this silence, the habit remained. Flowers on the path every year. And it was this habit that kept the tension alive, like a thin thread connecting the living to those who had not returned. The atmosphere in Greenwood became heavy, like the summer heat that hangs over the mountains and makes it impossible to breathe. This hopeless routine lasted exactly 7 years, and only then did a trail reappear in the darkness of the forest. A small find that was to change everything. The day turned out to be difficult in the morning. In the mountains, the air was heavy and sticky, and the sky was covered with low clouds that moved slowly over the treetops. For local hunter Harold Stevens, it was a familiar sign. A storm was approaching fast. He had been in the woods in the morning, following deer tracks, and planned to return in the evening. But when lightning cut through the Appalachian sky and the first clap of thunder rolled across the slopes, it became clear that he had to take shelter immediately. Harold knew these places well. About a mile off the trail, which was avoided by hikers, was an old woods cabin. It had once been used by woodcutters, then hunters, but it had been abandoned for 20 years. The man went there, hoping to wait out the bad weather. When he got there, the rain was already pouring down. The roof of the hut was only halfway up. The beams were rotten and the windows were broken. Inside, there was dampness and the smell of old wood. On the floor were pieces of furniture, pieces of glass, rusted jars left by someone decades ago. It seemed that time had stopped, and this space had not belonged to a person for a long time. Harold cleared a spot against the wall, set his rifle down, and wiped the water off his face. The thunder was so loud that the walls seemed to shake. It was unpleasant to sit in this hut. Every crack made noise, the wind swung the door, and the dust rose from the drafts. He looked around the junk without much interest until his eyes caught on something that didn't fit in. On an old table covered with a layer of dust was a small digital recorder. The silver case had almost no scratches, and the buttons looked functional. It was too modern to be in this crumbling hut, among the rotten boards and cobwebs. The hunter picked it up. There was a thin layer of dust on the surface, but the device itself looked intact, as if it had been put there recently. Harold knew that no one had lived in these places for a long time. The road to the cabin was overgrown, and most people didn't even know it existed. So the appearance of the recorder was strange. He was also surprised by another thing. The device weighed as if there were still batteries inside. He pressed the power button, and a short flash of the indicator confirmed that the recorder was working. Harold felt a chill run down his spine. In the old hut, where everything had fallen apart with time, this small modern thing looked like a foreign body. He didn't press any further. His instinct told him it was none of his business. In places like this, they found hunting traps and old cartridges, but not electronics, and certainly not something that could be preserved in working condition. When the rain subsided a bit, the hunter put the recorder in his jacket pocket. The thought that this thing had something to do with the long history of the missing girls haunted him. There was less talk about them in the town, but he remembered that year well. The bicycles under the oak tree, the hairpin on the trail, the search teams with dogs, and most importantly, the silence that remained after everyone left the forest with nothing. Harold decided not to leave the recorder in the hut. The next day, he took it to the police station. He said briefly, "I found it in the woods, hid in the hut during a thunderstorm." At first, the police were indifferent, but when they heard that the device worked, their attention changed. The thing that looked too neat and modern among the ruins could be the piece of the puzzle that had been missing for years. For the hunter himself, it was just a strange coincidence. For the town of Greenwood, it was the beginning of a new chapter in a story that everyone thought had long been completed. The recorder Harold brought was first put in a transparent bag and processed according to the procedure: registration, signature, time, and place of seizure. The device looked almost undamaged, with only the battery cover showing traces of moisture. The investigator on duty did the standard thing. He recorded the serial number, called a technician, and put the item in a temporary safe until morning. There was a lot of curiosity in the department. Everyone had heard about the long-ago disappearance of the two friends, but no one expected a real artifact from the forest after all these years. In the morning, the recorder was moved to the technical inspection room. It was quiet there, the lamps shone with a cold light, and the tables were covered with cables and small devices. The technician, following the protocol, did not press any unnecessary buttons. First, an external examination, then photographs from different angles, and then taking prints and dust particles for microscopy. When the lid was cut off from the case, the batteries became visible. There was a thin coating on the contacts, but no critical corrosion. It seems that the device was last turned on a long time ago, but not in conditions of complete flooding. This gave us a chance. Before touching the memory, the technician grounded the device and connected the recorder via an intermediate interface to avoid damage. The content structure appeared on the monitor screen: few directories, minimal system labels, and only one media file. The technician caught himself holding his breath. The format was standard, compressed, with no fancy settings. The date of creation was the summer of 2010. The relative time of the file is not always conclusive due to possible malfunctions in the device settings, but the coincidence with the period of the disappearance made me focus. The file was copied to an isolated media, a checksum was created, a copy was made for work, and the original was locked in a safe. When the door clicked shut, the only thing left in the room was the minute counter on the audio player and the silence that always precedes someone else's voice. The investigator asked to start by listening with headphones, without external acoustics. The technician turned on playback. The first seconds were almost empty. Noise typical of open space, distant whispering of the wind in the crowns, a short clang, perhaps the zipper of a lightning protection dog on a jacket, or a metal ring of a backpack. Then, breathing. Hurried, uneven, sometimes almost choking. Two timbres, one higher and one lower. They overlapped, were interrupted by the rustling of leaves, and at some point became whispers. The recording had no distinct phrases at the beginning, only fragments that the technician marked with tags for further filtering. Here, similar to a word; here, direction; here, a push. Then closer to the middle, the first thing that could be interpreted was heard. A voice with a higher pitch said briefly, sharply, almost wheezing, only, faster. The second voice answered more quietly, as if addressing the side. Wait, listen. These words had to be repeated several times in high headphones. The natural noise of the forest merged with the voices, but the tone of panic was felt even without linguistic analysis. The investigator called in a phonoscopist from the county laboratory. The room was prepared. Black curtains on the windows, sound-absorbing panels, a spectrum analyzer on the table, and software packages for cleaning up noise. They worked carefully, in layers, not gnawing away at the excess spectrum so as not to destroy the necessary ones. First, they removed the low-frequency hum, which sounds like a distant thunderstorm or wind blowing along the trunks. Then, we minimized the broadband rustle of leaves. Tiny windows of speech became clearer. Footsteps were heard disnine, troramine, closer and farther away, as if someone was not walking on a path but breaking dry branches on the slope. Between these steps, one of the voices whispered desperately, "Don't look. Go back." 2 times after that, a word was heard, which was tentatively labeled in the protocol as something or someone. The articulation was lacking, but the intonation was unambiguous. Fear of a presence behind. The middle of the file contained a section where the fear turned into practical actions. Someone could be heard tearing off something light, perhaps a jacket or scarf. A metallic clang suggested that a carbine or zipper had been hit. Then there is a short excerpt that was recorded in the laboratory transcript as an attempt to name a landmark. A lower-pitched voice seems to be saying a name, either ravine or mark or stone. The linguistic expert asked for more time. With such a signal-to-noise ratio, confidence in specific words could be misleading. Toward the end, a background tone appeared, similar to a wind whistle in a narrow space. The phonoscopist assumed that the recording was made when the girls passed a cluster of boulders or a narrow mark in the terrain where the wind sings between the stones. At the same time, they could hear confusion. He is not lagging behind. And again, irregular steps behind, this time much heavier, as if the foot was slipping on loose soil with branches. The culmination was a sharp sound, short, sharp, with a rich upper spectrum, which the report described as hitting metal or stone in the immediate vicinity of the microphone. Then there was a dull shake, as if the recorder had abruptly changed position, and immediately after that, absolute silence. Not the natural pause of the forest, but the silence of a device that is no longer recording. The file was cut off in the last few seconds, without a smooth fade out. It was as if someone had pressed a button, or the power had suddenly gone out. The investigator looked at the technician. He just nodded. There is something to give for further processing. We made copies for independent laboratories. One drive was packed for the State Phonoscopy Center, the other for the University Acoustic Group. It was important that the different teams listen to the same material without knowing about each other, which is how the impartiality of the conclusions is checked. By the evening, the primary transcript was prepared. It contained timestamps, a brief description of the events, and notes about possible words. The document used careful formulas, most likely female voices, lower pitch, speech, behavior characteristic of Hannah Reed, higher pitch, Catherine Morris, but warned that without control samples, no definitive statement could be made. Attempts to compare the timbres with school videos were left for later, as they required family permission and some legal steps. When night fell on the police station, the lights in the corridor stayed on for a long time. Someone played the file for the second or third time, as if hoping to hear something that had slipped away. But each time, the recording led to the same point: a whisper, footsteps, a word about something or someone behind them, a thud, and silence. The forest in the background remained indifferent. The news of the voices from the recorder spread beyond the offices the next day. Families were informed by phone. They spoke briefly, cautiously, without sensationalizing the situation. One recording was found in the device, additional examination was needed, and there were no conclusions yet. The other end of the line was silent for longer than usual. Then they thanked me and asked me not to rush into public comments. A printed spectrum was left in the laboratory room, a multicolored map of noises and voices that looked almost geographical on paper. The investigator signed it with a date and filed it in the case, which had become alive again. In Greenwood, where for many years people had spoken in hushed tones, the silence began to crack, not from screams, but from the return of something for which no one could find a name. The recording proved only one thing: that two girls were not running alone in the woods that day. All the other answers had yet to be extracted from the sound that so easily deceives the ear and so stubbornly preserves the last moments of others. The discovery of the recorder was the signal that forced the police to reopen the case. There was a tension in the department that was reminiscent of the first days after the disappearance. But now, after 7 years of silence, the investigators had a concrete lead. First of all, they decided to return to the abandoned hut. A hunter who came across the recorder showed them the exact location. The building stood in the middle of the forest, skewed and dilapidated, with a roof that had long been leaking rain. When the door opened again under the pressure, a wave of dust and the smell of dampness rose in the air. Flashlights snatched pieces of furniture, broken boards, and scattered cans from the darkness. It seemed that the hut had been dead for a long time. However, this time, in addition to the recorder, they found one more thing. In the far corner, under a collapsed shelf, there was a crumpled, dark-colored jacket. It was a rough, hunting jacket made of thick fabric. The outside was covered with stains and mold, but the inside lining was much better preserved. The jacket was carefully laid out on a tarpaulin and the pockets were checked. In the inner one, they found a crumpled piece of paper, a cash receipt. They managed to make out the numbers on it. It was a receipt from a small store in a neighboring town. It was dated a few months after Hannah and Katerina disappeared. For the investigators, this was stunning. It turned out that someone had come to the hut after the tragedy. The next day, the detectives went to the store. The owner had long ago changed the cash register equipment, but the archived data was still there. They confirmed that a man named Harold Keener, a resident of the district, had made a purchase that day. According to the clerk, he was a rare customer, usually buying small items like cigarettes or canned goods. The case was investigated further, and then the unexpected came to light. Harold Keener hadn't lived in the area for a long time. A few years ago, he moved out of town to the west of the state. A year later, he died in a fire. The house where he lived burned to the ground. His body was found and his identity was confirmed. The case was closed as an accident. For the investigators, it was a dead end. On the one hand, they finally had a name, a person who could have used the house and possibly knew what happened to the girls. On the other hand, there was no way to verify anything. All potential answers burned with him. The families took the news painfully. For them, the name of a stranger had no weight. What they wanted to know was what had happened to their children. And now it turned out that even if someone was involved, he was already dead. The feeling of hopelessness only intensified. The police had only a few things left: a jacket, a check, and a recorder. This was too little for a specific charge, but enough to officially change the status of the case. It was no longer a case of missing persons, but of possible murder. Greenwood started talking again. For some, the appearance of Keener's name was a confirmation of long-held suspicions that someone dangerous had always been hiding in the woods. For others, it was a futile trail that led nowhere. But everyone agreed on one thing: the silence that had lasted for 7 years had broken again. And with it came the fear that the forest had not just taken the girls, but had hidden someone's dark story behind it. The official wording of the case changed, but there were no more answers. After the case was reopened, the police noted possible outside interference. This was followed by a list of material evidence: a digital recorder with one file, a hunting jacket, a receipt from a neighboring town, and a few pages about a man who could have used the abandoned house but left the area and died in the fire. The documents were properly filed, but the main line was missing: the name of the man who had followed the girls along the trail in the summer of 2010. The recorder was transported to the district museum at the police station, not as an exhibit, but as evidence stored in the archives. It was in a transparent container with a sticker that strictly indicated the inventory number and date of transfer. When someone asked for permission to access a copy of the file, they were shown the protocol. It indicated the duration of the recording, timestamps, and a description of the background. The words "sharp sound" and "silence" were repeated from chapter to chapter, from letter to letter, as if it were a line that no one had ever crossed. Another wave of talk swept through the town. At first, there was hope. If there was a trace in the case, perhaps there would be an answer. Then there was disappointment when it turned out that the man to whom the check referred was no longer alive. Some took this as confirmation of the worst-case scenario, while others considered it a coincidence. In the coffee shop on the outskirts of Greenwood, 2 photos of Hannah Reed and Catherine Morris were again hanging. Next to them was a piece of paper with a police station number and a request to report any details that seemed important. The number was changed twice when it was moved to a separate line for cold cases. The families were given the right to familiarize themselves with the investigation materials, insofar as they did not compromise the secrecy of the investigation. They read, slowly turning the pages, pausing at the places where their names appeared as applicants 7 years ago. No one said out loud what they were avoiding to say. Even if the culprit existed, his death in a distant fire brings back nothing. In a press statement, Catherine's mother wrote succinctly, "We are grateful to everyone who has tried to help. We don't know the truth. We remember." It was a document that did not contain accusations, but it also did not contain forgiveness. The police made another foray into the forest, this time without cameras or volunteers. The purpose was technical: to clarify the geographical coordinates of the hut, record the condition of the building, describe the available entrances and exits, and mark a diagram for future reference. The plan included several arrows and notes on where to take shelter during bad weather. The report noted, "No recent life activity was found." This line chilled any imagination. The hut was empty, just as it had been during the first inspection. The recorder was an accident or someone's haste. A jacket is a material thing without a voice. The town was slowly returning to its normal routine. Homemade honey and apples were again being sold on the square. At the school, a poster about safety in the forest hung on the bulletin board. "Do not deviate from the route. Notify your loved ones. Take a basic kit with you. Check the forecast." The line about "always carry a phone with you" stood alone and looked like belated advice for those who had not returned. There are no signs of a real end to the case. Legally, the proceedings were left open. The investigation is ongoing. In practice, no new evidence was added. The receipt was checked again. The store changed ownership. The old video cameras were written off long ago, and the purchase database contains only dry items. The information about the fire, where the possible owner of the jacket died, was confirmed by the reports. Witnesses to the incident were questioned, but no firm links to Greenwood and the long-standing disappearance were found. Everything that never became a fact remained at the level of speculation. On the anniversary of the disappearance every June, several people gathered near the same oak tree where the bicycles once stood. They were silent longer than they spoke. Someone, unable to bear the silence, would play a fragment of the forest sound on his phone. Not the real thing, but recorded to calm him down. It looked strange, but the explanation was simple. They wanted to hear something different from what was in the recorder. There, in the short file, the forest sounded like a place where the air shrinks and words disappear. The journalists returned to the topic from time to time. They asked for a comment, but received familiar phrases in response. There are no final conclusions. The examination confirms the presence of an unauthorized person on the recording. The verification of the deceased man's involvement did not yield legally significant results. For viewers, this sounded like a denial. For those who worked with the materials, it sounded like honesty. It is better to recognize the limits than to invent an ending. In the final memorandum, the investigative team formulated the last paragraph as follows. According to the available data, it is impossible to recreate the full sequence of events that occurred on the forest trail in the summer of 2010. There is audio evidence of the presence of at least 2 victims and a third unidentified person. Some material findings indicate the possible use of the abandoned building by unidentified persons in the period after the disappearance. Sufficient grounds to charge anyone have not been found. This is the official open ending, not the end, but the frontier beyond which the unknown begins. The forest that began a few miles from Greenwood began to look like just a forest again. But for those who read the minutes and listened to the file, it remained different. The trail the two men had been walking on is now marked on the map with a red line that breaks off among the trees. Next to it is a small icon with a case number. On paper, it's just a sign. On the ground, it's a place where demonstrations, maps, and theories end and silence begins. The recorder, closed in a container, remains the main symbol of the case. It contains not an answer, but a limit. All that is known for sure is contained in a few minutes of intermittent breathing, rustling branches, and a short explosion of sound before silence. Then, there is an emptiness that cannot be filled with anything. Perhaps, someday another random object will come into existence, just as this device appeared in an abandoned hut during a thunderstorm. In the meantime, Greenwood lives with the unsolved, as do cities that are used to keeping cases without endings in their archives. There is no final explanation. Who or what was behind the disappearance of the two 17-year-old friends has not been found out. Sometimes, only a tire mark in the dry dust is found where their bicycles once stood, a foreign, random, meaningless trace. The forest falls back into silence, and in this silence, the same question remains, which is now rarely asked in Greenwood and whispered, what exactly was heard on the recording before it all came to an end?